Meanwhile, the Supreme Court dealt another blow to the president's agenda yesterday. They ruled that he didn't have the authority to order larger businesses to implement a vaccine or test requirement for workers. So Nancy Cordes is joining us now from the White House, following all of these stories to give us the details. It's back to the usual suspects. The president met with the two senators that have been a thorn in his side a little bit throughout his time in office so far, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, hoping to win them over with voting rights, with changing the filibuster rules. How is the White House characterizing the meeting that they had, what was discussed, and whether any progress was made?
Well, the White House says the meeting lasted for more than an hour. So that was the second time that day that the president spoke with these two senators, because he also met with senators on Capitol Hill. But as far as we know, no movement. They are completely dug in, despite the pressure that they are getting from all of their Senate Democratic colleagues, and now from some pretty prominent Democrats outside of Congress. We know that President Clinton, the former president, actually spoke with the two of them in recent weeks, trying to convince them not only to get behind changing the filibuster rules so that Senate Democrats can pass major voting rights legislation, but also to get behind the other big item on the president's agenda, which is stalled, and that is this big social spending bill the White House refers to as Build Back Better. They oppose that measure as well. But at this point, there is a growing recognition that all the pressure in the world is probably not going to move these two Democratic senators. They are listening, they are talking, but they don't appear to be changing their minds. Senator Manchin says he's open to some changes to the Senate rules, but based on what he has described, the changes that he's open to really wouldn't make much of a difference, wouldn't enable Democrats to pass legislation with a simple 51 vote majority, which is what they want.
And Nancy, President Biden has acknowledged he doesn't have the votes to change the Senate filibuster rules right now. So what options does he have to try to move his agenda forward?
He really doesn't. That's the problem. And he's under all of this pressure from his base, from voting rights activists, to do more, to come up with a plan to get this legislation passed. It is so meaningful to voting rights activists who say that states across the country are going to make it more difficult for minorities in particular to vote in November, and they want Congress to pass a law that would enable people in all 50 states to vote early, enable people in all 50 states to vote by mail, restore big sections of the Voting Rights Act that were recently struck down by the Supreme Court. But the problem is that beyond putting pressure on these two Democratic senators, beyond getting out there and talking about it and trying to raise awareness, the president's hands are basically tied. He has done what he can do by executive order to get the Department of Justice involved. What would really make a difference here, and everyone knows it, is for the Senate to be able to pass this legislation. But right now, there are just very few avenues to get that done because all Republicans are opposed to it.
And so the other disappointment for the president, as we mentioned, the Supreme Court ruled against the White House's vaccination policy for large businesses yesterday. It was a 6-3 decision, and the court said that the president's order is, quote, a significant encroachment into the lives and health of a vast number of employees. So how is the White House responding to this?
Well, they say, frankly, that they're going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out next steps, because this was a pretty clear denunciation of this new OSHA rule that would require large companies to either get their workers vaccinated or require regular testing. But in a way, it is not a complete loss for this White House, because the whole reason that they had that rule drafted in the first place was to provide some cover for businesses that wanted to impose stricter rules for employees, but maybe worried that there would be a big backlash if they did it. And so the fact that for months now that rule has been looming, and big businesses could say, well, we're just getting out ahead of the rule, and we're now going to require our workers to get vaccinated or get tested regularly. Some of the influence of that rule has already happened, has already prompted businesses to change to change their policies, even though this rule will now never go into effect because the Supreme Court has blocked it.
Nancy, looking forward when it comes to vaccine rules for larger businesses, what is the administration's next move, or do they even have one?
They really don't. If you look at the text of that Supreme Court decision, it was 6-3 against this rule. They said it was a sweeping mandate by the federal government, an overreach. Interestingly, they argued that COVID really isn't an occupational hazard in most businesses, which is a curious thing to say. I think most businesses have suffered from the impacts of COVID. All you have to do is look at store shelves to recognize that they can't do business as usual when so many of their workers either have COVID or are giving it to one another. But nonetheless, it's clear that tweaking this rule around the margins is not going to result in a significantly different opinion from these 6 conservative justices. Even listening to the arguments a few weeks ago, you could tell that they were going to strike down this rule and they didn't like it.
Or just walk into a meatpacking plant, a food processing plant, and look at how COVID has impacted those businesses and those workers.
Yeah, no kidding. And so, that was a curious comment that was in the ruling, but nevertheless, not entirely surprising that conservative justices would oppose a major new rule that had never been tried before. The Biden administration had argued that this was completely allowed, and in fact, Congress had given OSHA the authority to regulate things like vaccines when it had to do with the health and safety of U.S. workers. They say that's what OSHA was designed to do, but clearly the 6 conservative justices saw it differently.
So I'm sure the president wants something, positive to talk about, and he's going to be addressing the public a little later about the bipartisan infrastructure law and funding that states are going to be getting, particularly to repair bridges. It's not the sexiest thing in the world, but at least it's positive, I presume. What are we going to hear from the president?
Sure. So, the bipartisan infrastructure bill actually did pass. That was a big win for the president a couple of months ago. And now what he's going to be announcing or celebrating today is the fact that the money was allocated in that big bill. And now we're getting down to brass tacks. And the Department of Transportation has basically set up a system to allocate all of that funding when it comes to bridge repairs, which was such a significant portion of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So what he's going to be announcing is that they've come up with this system. It's going to allocate $26.5 billion to states, to tribal governments over the next 5 years to repair bridges. And they think that this is going to help repair approximately 15,000 highway bridges across the country. As you can imagine, when you're talking about that volume of money, when you're talking about that many bridges, the federal government's going to have to come up with a system to determine where the money is needed, where it isn't, to make sure that it is spent responsibly. And that is what the president is going to be celebrating today. The fact that, we've taken a step forward in figuring that out, and that some shovel-ready projects could get underway this year.
Nancy, thank you so much. We are expecting to hear from President Biden later today. He's scheduled to make remarks on the bipartisan infrastructure law at around 12:30 p.m. Eastern. You can stream that live once it starts right here on CBSN.